From the JAMA Network, this is Conversations with Dr. Bachner. Interviews featuring researchers and thinkers in healthcare about their publications in the latest issue of JAMA.
Good morning and welcome to Conversations with Dr. Bachner. It's Howard Bachner once again. I'm joined by Paul Offit. Paul's a physician, Maurice Hillman, professor of vaccinology at Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, a world-renowned vaccine expert, much in the news recently. And Paul's here to talk about the recent advisory committee meeting, the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee meeting that was held last week. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Howard.
So, Paul, before we get to the meeting, I have already mentioned that I wanted to talk about two other issues that really have been in the news every day. The first is the large number of cases. Tony Fauci's been on, Bob Redfield's been on. So many people have been so concerned about the winter months. It's gotten cold quickly. 60, 70,000 cases a day. Death rate's still lowish in comparison to the total number of cases, but hospitals are filling up, as are ICUs. Is this what we have to face for the next 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months? Paul, what's your sense?
Yes, this is what everybody always feared. And although the death rates aren't currently up, with hospitalizations and ICU rates up, you can assume deaths will follow. One would have imagined when it first raised its head in Wuhan that this is an envelope virus, a respiratory virus like flu, like paraflu, like RSV, that would be worse in the winter months and then would abate in the summer months. I think what surprised me, and I think a lot of people, was that this envelope virus spread by small droplets actually still raged in the summer months in hot and humid climates like Florida, Texas, Arizona. But I think everybody expected what's going to happen now. Worse, this will also face to some extent a flu epidemic, as we do every year. And now it may be that with masking and social distancing, we'll have a lesser flu epidemic than typically, but it's definitely going to be a twin-demic now, which wasn't true last year.
Paul, over the weekend, Tony, for the first time, talked about national legislation around masking, something the White House has really resisted. Scott Gottlieb had a piece yesterday in the Wall Street Journal supporting that. Are we there? Is that where we need to go to, national mandate on masking?
To say that the White House has resisted a national mandate on masking is a nice way to say it. I mean, they've done everything they can to downplay the importance of mask or social distancing. It's the only thing we have, and arguably the most powerful thing we have. I mean, I was on service last week. There were patients we saw who either had or were suspected of having COVID-19. If you gave me three choices of what to do, I could either be 6 feet away from that patient, or if I couldn't be 6 feet away, I could either wear a mask or get a vaccine. Number one, 6 feet away. Number two, if I have to be close to the person, wear a mask. Number three, get a vaccine. Assuming a vaccine is about 75% effective, a mask worn correctly is more effective than that. So masking is really an important thing to do. The problem is I think the nature of this country. We sort of were founded on individual rights and freedoms. People say it's my freedom not to wear a mask, or said another way, it's my freedom to catch and transmit a potentially fatal virus, which it isn't. But I just think it's very hard in this country to enforce it and get people to do it. But at the very least, the president and vice president, who have a platform, who've been given a tremendous platform, can at least demonstrate good behavior, which they refuse to do.
I don't know all the amendments, but I can't remember an amendment that somehow protected the right not to mask. We both are chuckling about it. But, we managed with seatbelts, okay? We finally convinced everyone, none of my friends, none of my children would ever get in a car and not put a seatbelt on. And somehow masking has taken on an entirely different life of its own.
Yeah, it's become a political statement. I think this is probably the only country in the world where masking is a political statement. It's been hard to watch.
Now, I know we want to get to vaccines, but the other issue that's come up, and you and I chatted just briefly about it before, is the so-called Great Barrington Manifesto and then the Snowden document response. Some have said the White House has embraced it. Let everyone become infected, protect the elderly, protect the most vulnerable, and you get to herd immunity. Comments?
Yeah, I think the White House has embraced. The White House doesn't have a plan. So now suddenly herd immunity induced by natural infection has become the plan. Right. But the premise is wrong. The premise is that a virus can affect enough people in the population that would provide immunity such that essentially the virus would put itself out of business. That's never happened. That's never happened for any virus. So historically, there's no support for it. Secondly, if you had to pick the perfect virus for which it would happen, it would be measles. I mean, measles is 10 times more contagious than this virus, than SARS-CoV-2. It has an R0 contagiousness index of close to 20, whereas this is less than 2. Two, measles induces lifelong sterilizing immunity. You are protected against all manner of infection, including asymptomatic infection. That's not going to be this virus. And nonetheless, despite that, before there was a measles vaccine, every year there would be about 1 to 2 million cases of measles. There'd be 50,000 hospitalizations, and there'd be 500 deaths from measles. So there's no such thing as this Great Barrington Declaration. Plus, about 30% to 40% of the population is really at high risk.
Right.
Greater than 65, obese. I mean, are we all supposed to stay indoors for the next couple of years while we're doing this? It just doesn't make a bit of sense.
Right. So let's turn to vaccines. I have a list of questions, but I wanted to give you a chance to summarize what you thought were the key exchanges between you and the FDA and the committee. That's so if you could comment. But the other thing is some of the committee members do have conflicts of interest because they consult to different companies. Have they been excluded from these meetings? I just wanted to clarify that for our listeners because it's a big issue.
3 voting members were excluded from this meeting because they either were consulting to a company or they were on the data safety monitoring board for a company.
The key exchanges. What do you think the key exchanges were, Paul, from the meeting last week?
I think the tension in this meeting was this. These are not going to be licensed products. They are going to be essentially permitted for use under emergency use authorization. And permission is the right word. It's the same that would be given to, say, an investigational new drug. Permission is being given to vaccinate 150 million Americans initially, which is obviously something we've never dealt with before. And I think that when the public hears, or frankly, the medical community hears the word emergency use authorization, they think correctly of hydroxychloroquine, which was approved or permitted through emergency use authorization when there were no data suggesting that it worked. And now there's clear data that shows that it didn't work to either treat or prevent the disease. And so the FDA then withdrew its permission through EUA. 10% of people who got that drug could have, cardiac toxicity, specifically arrhythmias. Then you had the convalescent plasma fiasco, where, again, no data showing that it worked, and nonetheless, that was permitted for use. So I think that's what people hear. They hear emergency use authorization for vaccines, and therefore vaccines are going to be allowed to be used with the same flimsy or lack of evidence for these other 2 products. But that said, the trials that are being done for these vaccines are typical of any licensed product. I mean, Pfizer's doing a 44,000 person trial. Moderna's a 30,000 person trial. Johnson & Johnson's a 60,000 person trial. That's like any licensed product. So why not do this as a licensure? Why not submit a biological license application and then license these vaccines by the method we always do that and drop the phrase emergency use authorization? And the reason is, and I mean, for example, the human papillomavirus vaccine trial was a 30,000 person trial. Our rotavirus vaccine trial, the RotaTeq trial, was a 70,000 person trial. The conjugate pneumococcal vaccine was a 35,000 person trial. The difference between those trials and these trials was length of study. So the HPV vaccine was a 7-year study. I mean, our rotavirus vaccine, RotaTeq, was a 4-year study. This, at most, will be a 6-month study. And the FDA would never license a vaccine with only 6 months of data. Not so much so for safety, because really with safety, they just want 2 months after the last dose. I mean, even for diseases like Guillain-Barré syndrome, you would see that within 6 weeks of getting a dose. So it's not safety so much, it's efficacy. I think you just can't license something with that little efficacy data. And if you put a vaccine out there with only 6 months of efficacy data, or frankly, it would be less than that, more like 3, 4, 5 months of efficacy data, I just think that you may be unpleasantly surprised that it is either very short-lived or not as robust as you imagine. So that's the problem. You have some people have now said, well, we'll just do these studies for 2 years. But on the other side, 225,000 people have died of this virus. I mean, with HPV, 5,000 people died a year. With rotavirus, 60 people died a year. So that's the tension, is how much uncertainty are we willing to live with, knowing that we're facing a virus that's brought us to our knees.
Paul, can we just go back to the safety? Because I did listen to and read snippets of the meeting, the 2-month safety data, and a statement that side effects like Guillain-Barré in the past have shown up generally within 2 months. That's with traditional vaccines. These are novel vaccines. Is there broad agreement that you would expect side effects or adverse events like Guillain-Barré to show up within 2 months, given that these are novel vaccines? I do worry that the public may not believe that 2 months is sufficient safety data. What's your sense of that, Paul?
So Stanley Perlman actually was brought in as a temporary voting member, and his expertise is in coronavirus immunology.
Okay.
And he argued that vaccine-induced immune pathology that was seen, for example, in animal models with SARS-CoV-1, in animal models for MERS, that you would think you would need about 4 months to see that. But if you look back at something like the measles vaccine, the inactivated measles vaccine that was brought into the United States in 1963 was found to actually cause this sort of unusual, atypical measles, which actually increased your risk of pneumonia. You had an unusual rash. It really took a few years to figure that out. So I think you're right. I mean, you have in this virus, SARS-CoV-2, this unusual virus that has already caused a number of clinical and pathological changes you would not have expected, which we are now meeting with vaccine strategies that have pretty much no commercial experience. I mean, I think we are going to have a learning curve here. The question is how much pain you need to live with in the meantime. I mean, so for example, that person in Brazil who died during, I think it was Johnson & Johnson's trial. When we heard that there was a death in a vaccine trial, everybody held their breath. And then we're able to breathe a sigh of relief when we realized that it was someone in the placebo group. Well, because he was in the placebo group, that's probably why he died of COVID-19. I mean, but for the flip of a coin, he ended up in the wrong group. I mean, I think it's less likely he would have died had he been in the vaccine group. And so that's always the tension we're working with here.
If you lengthen the efficacy data out to 6 months, then you do gain safety data for 6 months.
That's right. True.
So, I mean, if you match them together, then you gain much more information about safety. Now, what's the process? You have this discussion last week. How does David Mark and his group at the FDA then take it in? Because Moderna has said they're going to qualify for an EUA in November, December. You and I talked about it beforehand. I prefer they stop making that statement. They have no idea if they'll qualify for an EUA. That's not up to them. They will apply for an EUA. I think some of the other companies have been more appropriate in their statements that we are warming up. We will apply for an EUA in November, December. Moderna said they'll get one. I don't know how they know that. Does the FDA now think about what your recommendation